Hello, and thanks for listening to the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Chris Irvin. Chris is one of these guys who is just on another level when it comes to making the ketogenic diet super easy to understand and really easy to use. So he takes all the research all the time, breaks it down in these really digestible bites, and makes it so easy for somebody to just jump in and start using this diet in a really meaningful way. Him and I geek out all the time when we get together and chat about this type of stuff, and this conversation was no exception. So I'm sure you're going to learn something from this. I always do whenever I chat with Chris. He's one of my go-to guys when it goes to anything keto and research. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Chris, thanks for being on the show, my man.
Hey, good. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, so you were one of the top people when I started this podcast that I had notch up there because ever since I met you, which was last year at PaleoFX, I've been following along with a lot of the stuff you do and your background, which I'm sure you can tell everybody about in a second. But you are one of the top people, in my opinion, in the whole space that actually has a evidence-backed background with everything that you say. So I appreciate that you're not just ripping off other bloggers and saying things that are trendy. So good work there. Do you just want to tell folks a little bit about how you got in the space and kind of what your focus is now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. But yeah, so I got started into keto. It's going to be coming up on 3 years now since I started my ketogenic diet journey myself. I have a background in exercise and nutrition science. That's what my undergrad was in. And I came down to Tampa, Florida in 2015 to get my master's degree in exercise and nutrition science. And that's where I was introduced to keto. And I started researching keto. Initially, it was in athletes. So I was doing a lot of research on the ketogenic diet for, just for maybe not necessarily high level athletes, but, a good, well-conditioned college kids, people who, are working out very frequently. And we were looking at different strategies for getting these people into ketosis quicker and how we could best optimize the diet for them. And that's where I started. Just with my sports background, I thought that was kind of a really good introduction for me because it was something that I was passionate about. But then after about 3-4 months of doing that, I actually came across the book Tripping Over the Truth by Travis Christofferson.
Oh, man, it's an intense read. It's long, it's deep, but it's awesome.
I love when I bring it up and people have actually read the book before, because I really think that it's like the number one book that you should read if you're interested in not just keto, but kind of the metabolic side of a lot of different conditions. And he writes, and I've actually had the pleasure of meeting him because he was down here for a couple conferences in Tampa, and he's just a great guy, and his writing style is fantastic. But so after reading that book, I was just kind of blown away with this other side of keto that I really didn't even know existed at the time because I was so new to it. And I remember, I borrowed that book right before heading to Christmas break that year of grad school. And I finished it, within the week I was home, and I came back and just started diving into research on cancer and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and became really, really passionate about it. So about 2 or 3 months after that, I started interning in the metabolic therapeutics lab at the University of Southern Florida. And that was Dr. D'Agostino's lab with Dr. Poff and all the other great professors there. So I spent a good, I think it was 2 or 3 months volunteering there, doing some keto research with animals, just kind of getting to learn from them. They're definitely some of the brightest minds in this community. And that just kind of got me turned into just really being passionate about keto for all the different health benefits that it could give. But for me, I kind of knew that I was a little bit different, and going the traditional academic route and doing research that way wasn't what was really making me tick. And I kind of felt a need for, I saw a lot of people out there who I think it was the first conference I went to. I saw a lot of people who this was their first time hearing about keto, but they were suffering from all these different conditions. And it was really like disheartening to me because like all these researchers that I had so high respect for, like Dr. Volek and Dr. Seyfried and Dr. Poff and all these people, that I felt like a lot of their research was getting lost in journals. And that's kind of where I kind of took a dive into trying to develop content and spreading out awareness and information about keto in a way that, the general population could not only understand but apply to their life. So that's kind of been my focus since getting into the research side a couple of years ago.
Yeah, man, you do a hell of a job taking research and making it digestible into like a simple square infographic. So go work on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It took me some time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a battle. It's a struggle to be able to convey that much information in such simple terms. And so, I mean, especially like you said, when this stuff can get lost in translation or just lost entirely because it's such a fad right now. Keto is so trendy that I think that a lot of stuff just gets regurgitated over and over and over again. And then you end up with these pseudo myths that are hanging around there just because somebody wrote about it in a blog post. And then everybody who wrote something new or talked to somebody else about it just read that thing, and then they read a new thing that somebody else wrote citing that, and it's just this never ending cycle. And so thank you for kind of breaking that with the actual research. And then I wanted to touch on, you made a really good point chatting earlier about it wasn't just about a fat loss thing for you. I think that's how a lot of people are getting into this now in general, because usually fat loss is great. I think it's a fantastic thing, but that's how I think a lot of people are entering this space now. But you said that there was all these things that you noticed that a ketogenic diet could be applied for. And can you just touch on some of those things? I mean, I think that tripping over the truth is a good example of how just carbohydrates and fats in general play into metabolism and that of malignant cancer cells. But what are some other ones that you've done some research on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so it's actually funny. I was talking to somebody about this morning because there's so many conditions that the ketogenic diet can be beneficial for. And I feel like sometimes it's almost a bad thing because a lot of people think that it's kind of quote unquote like this miracle diet because it can help with so many different things. But I think the reason why this is happening is because there's some common characteristics with a lot of the diseases that are so common today that the ketogenic diet can improve. And that's kind of how it gets its ability to help in so many different ways. So I think that like a lot of diseases that are really prone to like inflammation, things like Alzheimer's, and obviously cancer, like they can play a huge role into that. And then, you see a lot of stuff with like PCOS. There's stuff out there with like endometriosis, and, two other conditions that are very highly characterized by inflammation. So it feels like there's kind of a common trend with that. But there's also a lot of other things out there too with like autism and Parkinson's, and autism was one that was kind of struck home for me because I had some family members that were going through that. So that was kind of a big one for me that I did a lot of research in. But I think the two that really struck out to me that I've done the most research in have been cancer and then like the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And like MS, stuff like that. So really there's so much out there, but kind of the limitation to it that I always tell people is there's certain parts of this that there's a lot more research on, and there's certain parts of this that still need a lot of research done. But I kind of always tell people that with the ketogenic diet's ability to improve so many common characteristics between diseases, that's kind of what gives its ability to treat so many different things or help manage symptoms of so many different things.
Right. And one of the ways that I like to look at it is that, I mean, one of the great things about a ketogenic diet is that it gives mitochondria, which are the little powerhouses inside of our cells, an alternative and quote unquote cleaner fuel source. And it seems to me that a lot of these conditions that it's really effective at treating stem from dysfunctional mitochondria from the beginning. And this is the whole point of tripping over the truth as well. And in a lot of these different things, a lot of reasons why our general lifestyle now, obviously food is a huge part of it, but I mean, stress, lack of sleep, I mean, all the toxins in our environment, a lot of these things play to mitochondrial dysfunction. And so when you give your mitochondria a better, cleaner fuel source, sometimes it's like people just turn the lights on for the first time. Yeah. And that's kind of the common theme that I get when people who have never been fasting before, they've never really eaten low carb, end up in ketosis, like actually utilizing ketones for fuel, a couple of weeks maybe after they start doing this type of way of eating. I noticed that that's kind of a common thing they say is like, oh, finally, it's like I'm awake. Have you noticed some of this happening with people that you've worked with as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And to touch on that too real quick, I think the two things with that is that a lot of people, when they look at things like mitochondrial dysfunction and stuff, the big question like we see in cancer is a lot of times people ask like, well, which comes first? Is it like genetic alterations or is it metabolic alterations? And that's kind of the question with a lot of these conditions out there. And the thing that I always say is it doesn't really matter which one comes first.
Exactly.
If that's there, if your cells have the inability to utilize glucose, whether that's related to like insulin resistance or impaired mitochondrial function, then you shouldn't be feeding your body carbs. And I kind of think that a lot of these conditions, we know that chronic carb consumption can lead to that. So I definitely think that you hit the nail on the head there with that. But yeah, with the energy thing, it's definitely true that a lot of people, when they first start keto, they don't really know what they're getting themselves into, and they might struggle at first. But the second that they start like burning ketones, and they start not just producing them, but like I said, burning them, becoming efficient with burning them, your brain's running on them, people's energy, their mood, their mental clarity just starts going through the roof. And for me, I remember that's what kind of sold me was I always kind of joke that, if somebody told me that fasting and a ketogenic diet was bad for me tomorrow, I might still do it just because I feel so darn good on it. So that's kind of where a lot of people stand, is that a lot of people, I put out something the other day talking about, do you have to stay on a ketogenic diet forever? And so many people responded with like, well, why would you ever want to come off? So it's like once they see this increase in energy, they're just kind of hooked on it.
Right. And so you touch on a few things here saying that, some people struggle when they get on that. And also that when they're actually burning the ketones, and that's something that I mentioned earlier as well. And there's a distinction between just having ketones on your blood meter or on your P strip and actually using those as fuels. So why don't we just touch on quick, what have you seen people struggle with to get started? And then how can people like really know that they're actually using it, and what can they expect from when they actually become fat adapted?
Absolutely. So this is something that I'm really passionate about, because I always kind of preach about the ketogenic diet being a lifestyle. And, most diets suck. So the biggest thing is trying to figure out a way to make this diet not suck, so you can turn into a lifestyle long term. And I think the biggest thing with that is, how you start the diet and making sure that you're getting off on the right foot. So a lot of times, we see that people, when they first start, you get people talking about the keto flu. It could be brain fog. It could be, they could have some confusion, muscle cramps, their mood might dip. It varies per person. And that's really the hardest part to get through with keto, because a lot of people, they get to that point and they quit. And I think it's because, like you touched on, there's a difference between producing ketones and utilizing them. And one of the things we know is that, you can fast or restrict carbs for a day and you can be producing pretty sufficient levels of ketones, depending on, your levels of insulin sensitivity and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that your cells have adjusted to being able to take these ketones in and use them. So a lot of times I see people, they get discouraged during that first week or two, because they're testing their blood and they're saying, oh, I'm up to like 1.0, 1.5, but I don't feel good. Like, what's going on? And, I think the biggest thing during this time is kind of regardless of where you're at with this, when you start, you're going to go through some bit of trouble with it. So you want to do your best to alleviate some of those symptoms, because it's going to take your body time to adjust to burning these ketones. So one of the big things during this period of time that I see, and I'm sure you've probably seen this a lot too, is like electrolyte deficiencies.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of times, like people, they call it like something like carb withdrawal, or they call it something else when they experience like brain fog and stuff like that. But usually it's just because, the ketogenic diet promotes, it promotes a lot of, drop of water, and you're becoming deficient in electrolytes. So, being deficient in things like sodium is going to relate to like brain fog that you might experience. And, being deficient in sodium and potassium and magnesium can lead to like the muscle cramps you may experience. So, I always tell people that during this keto adaptation period, the best thing you can do is make sure that you're getting enough fat in, and that you are replenishing electrolytes and staying hydrated. And the other thing that I typically kind of add in there that's usually a little bit taboo is that I think keto adaptation is like a great time for exogenous ketones. I think there's several reasons why, but at the very least, I think that exogenous ketones during this time can be a great way to get your body used to having ketones in the blood and providing your brain with some energy until your body becomes like a more efficient producer and user of these ketones.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that you said that, because if I said that, people were gonna be like, "Oh, he's just trying to sell them." So
right.
I paid you to come on here and say it for me.
I promise I'm not getting paid, guys.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where your body and your cells literally have to go through changes on the cell surface to be able to take a ketone and burn it as fuel.
Right.
I mean, this is something that like literally your cells need to change, especially if you've never really have been running on these fuels for your whole life. And so, like you said, ingesting some of this stuff, one, you're just going to feel a lot better because you're going to have a lot of different benefits. But one of them that I noticed a lot when I was going in and out in the beginning was just a more stable energy system. And then another one is you're going to help push that transition on a cellular level into using fats for energy. And so even if you jack up your fat entirely, I mean, your body is not going to be breaking it down for ketones if it can't use that fuel source. And so then that's where the energy crashes come from. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why I'm a big proponent of like not just the energy benefits of the ketones during this time, but like you said, our cells have to adapt and they have to, upregulate the transporters that are responsible for taking these ketones in. I don't want to go too heavy into the weeds on that, but one of the things that research has shown us is that having higher blood ketone levels can potentially enhance this process. So from like a cellular level too, like you said, that's where I think they can come in too is, if you're somebody who say you're new to keto and, maybe you have a lot of weight to lose and that's your goal, you might be suffering from like a lot of insulin resistance, and that could make it harder for you to break down fat and produce ketones initially. So, that could really delay your keto adaptation period. So that's kind of where I think coming in with exogenous ketones can be a great buffer and a great kind of like springboard into, a well-formulated ketogenic diet.
So I wrote an article about this, and I want to get your opinion, but a question that I get a lot is, does taking exogenous ketones stop fat loss? Yeah, that's my response too.
Yes, I love this one. So I have a different outlook on this too, because I think, and it's funny, I got this question like 4 times last week, so I recorded a video on it too, because I was like, I got to get these thoughts out of my head, so I went on a rant. But I think that people look at it as like cut and dry. They say they either do or they don't, and they don't really think about like situational how it happens. So, I think that if you're thinking about, I'm going to take exogenous ketones before my exercise session, and that's going to help me burn more fat, maybe not during that training session, because, you are providing your body with a fuel source that could, in that acute time frame, limit the need for you to, break down fat and produce ketones because you're providing it. But there's so many other things that are going on that the exogenous ketones are doing to promote fat burning long term, like mitochondrial biogenesis, which we can dive into. There's all the stuff with like brown adipose tissue and activating that from exogenous ketones. And then just like the increase in like energy, just your body's it is gonna burn more energy if you're more active because you're feeling better. So a lot of people look at it as like cut and dry, and it's not that simple.
Well, not only that, but one of the points that I make in my article is that that's like saying if you eat any fat, then you will never burn any fat. Just because you're consuming, I mean, you're just consuming the breakdown of what your body would do breaking down fat. And so that's like saying that you're going to go on a fat-free diet so that you'll use fat. I don't understand that how that stuff gets tied together.
And that's why Atkins didn't work, right? That's why it wasn't as effective as what people probably thought it would be, kind of,
Which is what?
Well, just because Atkins diet was typically just was lower protein. And a lot of people, like I've talked to people a lot where, lower fat on Atkins, but I've talked to a lot of people who, when they hear about keto, they're like, oh, that's like the Atkins diet, right?
Right.
But, when they did the Atkins diet, they were eating low carb and low fat. And maybe they were losing some weight, but they felt terrible because they probably weren't producing enough ketones or getting enough energy. So, that's kind of, I've kind of thought about that a lot too. When people say that about ketones, is that, you can't just starve your body completely. There's still a lot of benefit to providing, all these additional nutrients.
Right. And so this is another thing too, that Atkins is not ketosis. And so a lot of times when people try to argue against a ketogenic diet. I just posted a response on my website about this Vox article that was everywhere called "The Keto Diet Explained," and one of the biggest the sub headline was "The Keto Diet Doesn't Work for Weight Loss," and then they quoted a study that's clearly said the Atkins diet when compared to blah 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 blah. Okay, well, those two are not the same thing. An Atkins diet is not utilizing ketones for energy. Like those are just two separate things. An Atkins diet is just emission of carbohydrates. And that doesn't always mean that you're in ketosis. Just like eating carbohydrates doesn't mean you have diabetes. Like those are two separate things. And not to mention, so people conflate those two things like they're one and the same. Not to mention that if you actually look at that post and her graph that she uses, there was significant weight loss. And in the conclusion of this article, it said, following an Atkins diet allows for significant weight loss when compared to these three other diets. And there was a graph that clearly showed it, yet her conclusion was that a ketogenic diet doesn't work for fat loss. Bizarre. and this is some of the stuff that I'm talking about, where I'm glad that people like you are out there doing the work, because this type of misinformation goes on and on to try to get clicks, to try to sell ad space. And this is just where we're at. So anything else so I don't say it, and I'm not the one being called biased here, but research on effectiveness of exogenous ketones and what else they can do?
I think, the biggest ones that I've looked into with them, with exogenous ketones, is the stuff with like mitochondrial biogenesis and brown adipose tissue. But one of the things that I was having a talk with somebody about the other day that I thought was really interesting is there's actually, and I'll have to come up with a study, but there's actually some old research out there showing that exogenous ketones can stimulate muscle protein synthesis too, which I think is super interesting because, obviously we know that ketones are muscle sparing. So that's a big thing with them is that when you have elevated blood ketones, you usually spare the breakdown of leucine, which is, the biggest muscle building amino acid. And now there's research that's coming out it's actually some older research, but it's showing that it can promote muscle protein synthesis too. And it kind of brings up this like really unique thing of like, does that mean you can, build muscle and lose fat at the same time on a ketogenic diet? Because, really we've seen that as in the past, a lot of people have thought that you can't do those two things. But I mean, the truth is that we do see people that are able to do that on keto. And I think that could be part of the reason. So that's kind of another big area of exogenous ketones that I'm passionate about, just, with having like a background in sports and having like a little bit to do in the fitness industry and stuff, is I think that's a big thing where when people start talking about, when the ketogenic diet, you can't build muscle on, I'm like, well, ketones can promote muscle protein synthesis. So what does a ketogenic diet with exogenous ketones do? I think that it could be very beneficial in that case.
Right. And so what's your opinion on this whole field of you can't build muscle on a ketogenic diet?
Well, it's really hard for me to do it for me to say anything about it because I've done it myself. I've gone through periods of time where I've tested different strategies with keto and I've DEXA'd and tested, my muscle mass and fat mass and everything. And I have a lot of people too, like you look at guys out there like Robert Sykes, he's a keto savage, and Danny Vega, he's keto counterculture. Both of those guys on social media, they're big time. Like, Robert is like a natural bodybuilder that uses keto, and that guy's got a ton of muscle mass. And, when you see that guy like prep for a show and stuff, it's very evident that he's not losing muscle during that prep. He's actually, it seems like he's gaining it. So I've just seen so many people that, I think the biggest thing with it really, and this is kind of I'll go on a little sub rant with it, but the biggest reason why a lot of people think that a ketogenic diet is bad for muscle gain or it's bad for strength and performance is because they're not allowing for keto adaptation. So a lot of these studies, when you look at something that's looking at muscle mass or something that's looking at performance, they're like 4-week studies where they put somebody on the ketogenic diet for 4 weeks and then they were surprised that maybe their muscle mass was lower or that their strength and power were lower. But when, we know that, if somebody would have had me do like a bench press or a squat or something before starting keto and then doing it 4 weeks later, like I would have been weaker too.
That brings me to like protein consumption.
Yeah.
There's such a fear right now in a ketogenic circle that, if you're over 50 grams of protein, you're not going to be in ketosis anymore. Can you explain this? You just posted a really helpful video, but can you just touch a little bit of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one that I've done a lot of self-experimentation on this, with altering like my protein levels, and manipulating fat in conjunction with it to see like how my body responds, and testing ketones along the way too. But I think this obviously this fear of protein overconsumption is coming from this process of gluconeogenesis, where the body is taking substrate, non-carbohydrate substrate, and converting it to glucose. And protein has amino acids that can be used for that process. But this process of gluconeogenesis is necessary in the body, and it's especially necessary during a ketogenic diet because there are certain cells in our body that can't use ketones, that do need glucose for fuel. And since we're not eating them, we do need this process in our body taking place to produce them. And there's a lot of research that's shown like people on keto that, maybe if they're coming in like fasted in the morning and they have a meal or something and there's an elevation in gluconeogenesis rates, but they see that kind of tapers off throughout the rest of the day, and it overcompensates and balances itself out. So this whole thing with protein consumption, I think it's a little bit of a fallacy. I think that a lot of times, if you're somebody who maybe you're first starting keto and you're extremely insulin resistant, and we know like if you're insulin resistant, your body's not going to break down fat very well. Maybe that makes a difference when it comes to like your different macronutrient consumption. But I really haven't seen anything in myself or anybody that I've worked with having, with too much protein being a huge issue on keto.
Right. So, I mean, this is one of the things too that I think is a hot button issue, but the carnivore diet, I've actually been on it for about 2 weeks now.
Oh, wow.
And hitting like 140 grams, I'm not tracking day to day, but 140 grams of fat a day and like 120, 140 grams of protein per day. Mm-hmm. And this is way more protein than I was getting on a ketogenic diet, but I am actually still in the same level of ketosis that I was beforehand. So between like 0.8 and 1.0, and I actually feel way better. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and I think we could dive in forever about that, but yeah, no change for me and this is just a clear thing too, that like, I don't think that protein matters as much as people are saying. I think that it really depends too on your activity level, and a whole bunch of other factors, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as looking at a macro calculator and saying, okay, if I go over this gram threshold, then I'm not going to be in ketosis and everything's going to be ruined.
Right. And that's kind of something I always tell people too, is like, everybody, I'm a huge proponent of self-experimentation. I think it's great. But everybody freaks out about like blood ketone readings. And that's kind of where some of this like scare about protein comes from, is people are eating meals that are higher in protein and then they test their ketones and their ketone levels are different than they were before. So they think all these things are changing, but they don't really realize that like, it's not really clear cut how to interpret those results. And my biggest thing that I always tell people is like, how do you feel? Like if you do this carnivore keto diet and you're feeling great, then your body's in ketosis. Like you're going to know if your body's being kicked out of ketosis, because if anybody out there that's done keto and then has gotten kicked out of it, you feel pretty bad the next day usually. Unless you have good strategies in place to get yourself back in. So a lot of times, like I always tell people, when it comes to like self-experimentation, the best thing is just to listen to your own body. And, I haven't really seen anybody yet who's reported like, oh yeah, I'm over consuming protein and I can just feel my energy's down or something like that. Usually it's like you said, it's kind of the opposite, where they feel better because if there's somebody who's highly active, now maybe their recovery is a little bit better. Maybe that new extra protein that they had is beneficial and is something that their body actually needed.
Right. So one of the things with me that I've noticed even in the last 2 weeks is that on a ketogenic diet before, when I was limiting obviously carbs and then protein was very, very moderate, maybe 60 to 70 grams a day, I would feel typically like trash after like really heavy training days. Mm-hmm. It's like if I squatted really heavy or deadlifted really heavy or did some Olympic weightlifting, I'd feel like trash the next day or day and a half. And my hypothesis is like, okay, I need to maybe time carbohydrates in a little bit better, and maybe instead of 30 grams, get 60 grams in those days. Try that. Didn't really work that well. Having this amount of protein is actually like takes care of that problem entirely. I've felt phenomenal after those workouts now, even after 2 weeks. And so this is another strategy where I think people, if they're having trouble with really hard workouts, might want to explore just increasing the protein instead of thinking about increasing the carbohydrates.
Yeah, and that's actually how I got started with going a little bit higher protein. Was it was I guess it's been probably a year now. I started getting back into playing a lot of basketball, and I was playing basketball like 3 times a week in the morning. And so on those days I was training too. And like you said, like I would come home at night and I would feel horrible. And the next day I would wake up and I'd be sore. My legs would be sore, whatever muscle group I trained that day would be sore. So I just kind of like, I was thinking, the same thing. I was like, maybe it's something where should I start, planning on doing targeted keto and implementing carbohydrates, or, maybe it's just protein. So the first thing I did was I just started, adding to whatever I was doing before. I started adding a protein shake and started noticing that I was feeling a lot better. And that was kind of when it hit for me, where it's like, my demand for protein is probably a lot higher than some of these initial studies that established the 20 to 25% rule as being the rule of thumb. My protein demands are probably higher than the people that are in that study, just because of the activity level that I'm getting in. So that's why, like, whenever somebody kind of asks like where to start, I think that like the 20 to 25% rule for protein is maybe a good rule of thumb if you're new to the diet. But I don't think it's something that you have to stick with forever. And I think that testing out different things like upping it or, manipulating your macros and stuff is really important to optimize the diet for yourself.
Yeah. And another thing too is about, there's another 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And this is something too, where I feel like for me, that's extremely low. That was about like the 50 to 60 range. And for me, like I said, I felt awful on it. And I think that a lot of this research comes out, it's not really like super active people and like people who are doing weight training. It's like you can maybe follow these general guidelines if you're not approaching that. But if you're somebody who tries to do any rigorous physical activity, I'm going to tell you can handle more protein, and you're probably going to need it as well. And you said you were getting it from protein shakes. Like, it doesn't need to be like any magic source. I typically just get them from, especially right now with the carnivore diet, I'm eating really fatty cuts of meat. And so like ribeye, beef ribs, things like that. And I felt great. And so again, N=1 type of experiment here, but this is something that I held as what I thought for a very long period of time, is that ketosis was going to be something that would only be energy type of system that I would work on if I had low amounts of protein. Well, it turns out to not to be the case. So always test yourself is what I learned from that, which is always kind of a common rule here.
Right. And I think the other thing too is that I think the biggest like rule of thumb is, rather than worrying about protein and stuff, I think that it's restricting calories. And I think being in a restricting carbs and keeping yourself in a calorie deficit. So I do think that there's a big benefit. Obviously that can change depending on your goal, but I do think that like the best ketogenic diet is one in which your calories are a little bit restricted, just because, we know that calorie restriction in general is good for health. So I do think that that's a bigger thing, but I don't think that means that has to come from restricting your protein a huge amount.
What do you think about people who go on a ketogenic diet and eat like 800 to 1,000 calories a day?
Yeah, see, to me, it's really challenging because, the old me before keto would say that, that's not a good idea because you're going to be changing your metabolic set point, and that could lead to a lot of problems and probably lead to like an increased risk of weight gain and all this stuff later. But I do kind of think that a ketogenic diet does have a metabolic advantage, where maybe that's not as huge of a deal, but I don't think it's something you should do long term. So like, I think that if you're going to go through any period of time of being on 1,000 calories, I would do it keto, because obviously being in a state of ketosis is going to make sure that you're sparing muscle and whatnot. But I don't think that that's something that is beneficial to do for, 8, 12, 16 weeks at a time. Maybe if you want to kind of flirt with getting into a deeper state of ketosis, restricting your calories that low might help with that. But the other thing, like I said before, quality of life, eating 800 calories a day isn't going to be a great way to make sure you stay on keto.
Right. And one of the things too is that people go from eating 3,500 calories a day in the standard American diet to 800 calories a day in a ketogenic state, and they go, "Oh man, I feel like shit."
Yeah.
Well, you just cut your energy consumption and you're changing the substrate by a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. And yeah, your body's going to start asking for more fuel and not going to be happy when you don't give it much.
Right.
What sources of fat do you typically recommend for people on a ketogenic diet?
So there's a couple different ones. Obviously, we know that anything that's rich in MCTs is really good. So huge fan of like using MCT oil and coconut oil. But then I think the next thing is just getting really nutrient dense fat sources. So like for me, avocado is one of the main ones. There's so many good things that come from avocados, and things like salmon and nuts are great sources. So I always tell people like the best fatty foods you can have on keto are going to be the ones that are the most nutrient dense. But for somebody who maybe you like leaner cuts of meat, and that means that you're not getting enough fat in your diet, that's kind of where I think like something like MCT oil and coconut oil is really big. Just because that can kind of come in and give you that extra source of fat that maybe you're not getting yourself.
Right. One of the things I want to point out there that I think is very important is that if you're eating lean cuts of meat and then getting all of your fat from plant sources, you're going to be missing out on a lot of nutrients. Like there's a lot of vital nutrients to thrive as a human that are in animal fat only. And so if you start eating really lean cuts of meat, you're going to have problems here. And so like this is where I think obviously we carry MCT oil products. I think it's very beneficial, but you can't get all of your fats from these sources. Like really great for energy metabolism, and we can go on about MCTs and why they're a little bit different than other fats in general. But they're typically, look at the nutritional components. Like to get real nutrients that you need as an animal, you need to eat animal products, and there's just no way to get around that.
Yeah, and there's kind of the funny thing too about like everybody freaks out about saturated fat and stuff, and really there's a lot of health benefits to getting saturated fat in your diet. So the type of fat that you're getting from some of these fattier sources is probably better anyway. So that's a big thing that I always tell people too, is like a lot of people when they start keto, they're still kind of under that impression that like red meat is bad for you and you shouldn't have it and all of that. So they kind of inherently get stuck eating some of these leaner protein sources like chicken and turkey. So that's usually something that I kind of have to battle is it's one thing to convince people that fat is okay, but it's another thing to convince people that like saturated fat and red meat is okay. So sometimes you have to tackle those battles once at a time. But I definitely agree with you on that one.
That's a really good point. I was going to mention that. I felt like I was on this crusade forever trying to convince people that fat wasn't bad for them, and now I feel like I need to start a new war and tell people like which fats are not bad for them.
Right.
Because I think that there's so much ridiculousness out there in the keto world, especially the keto Instagram world, where people say that, look at my ketone meter, I'm in ketosis. Like, yeah, that can be the case. But if you're eating all these vegetable oils and all these really unhealthy fats, like you're not going to be a healthy person. And there's a difference between using ketones as fuel and being actually healthy. And like you can still have very, very high inflammation markers and troubles with weight loss and all these different things. So whenever I have somebody tell me like, oh, my blood markers did this on a ketogenic diet, I'm not losing weight and I'm stalling, I'm still having these problems, my first question to them is always, are you eating real food? Like, are you eating food that a human could eat? And if the answer is no, then I'm like, okay, well, let's start there and track your ketone levels and see if you can do that in ketosis, and then see how everything reacts to each other.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why like it's kind of a battle of, I'm a huge fan of a lot of like these different keto products, food products are coming out there for people. But sometimes like, some people, they just have a sweet tooth, and that's not good for them to have access to that all the time, because it does lead to nutrient deficiencies because they're only eating that and they're not getting real food. So, I always tell people it's like, if you want to have those foods, I think that some of these keto snacks are great because they can be the thing that keeps you on a ketogenic diet, because maybe you're getting that whatever treat or meal is that you can't really have on keto, and maybe that helps you stay the course. But at the same time, you have to make sure that that's complementing your diet, not consuming your diet where, like you said, you're not getting enough nutrients because you're avoiding whole food consumption.
Right. I mean, a lot of these things, it's like, if you were to be a human without machines, without food production, how easy would it be to eat that food? And if the answer is really hard or impossible, probably eat less of those. Like, I'm not saying like coconut oil would be tough, man. Like, could you imagine being on the wild and like smashing a coconut open and then like trying to squeeze it out and get oil? No, you just eat the
shaking a tree down. Yeah.
And you'd obviously drink the coconut water, but that would be keto, so let's not go there. But I mean, all those things, like olive oil, things like that, it's like they're not bad or bad for you. That's not what I'm saying. However, it's like the things that come as easy and with less steps are probably more of what you should be eating. So that's where it comes back to animal products and animal fats like that.
Yeah, that's a good outlook on that. I like that.
Anything else that you think is like kind of like a hot topic keto myth right now?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're still catching some of the flack from the What the Health Netflix series that came out. There was a bunch of stuff on dietary fat with that, but I feel like now we're kind of getting to the point where we know that we've debunked a lot of that stuff.
I never even watched it. Did you watch it?
No, you know what? I tried to. I avoided it for like a week, and then everybody started talking about it, and I sat down and I watched like 5 minutes of it, and I knew that it was going to make me really angry. And I'm kind of really pro like meditation and doing everything to keep myself in the right state of mind. So I couldn't actually sit down and watch it. But I did read some articles where people were highlighting all the stuff that they were saying, and I really couldn't believe it.
It's the anti-meditation, huh?
Yeah, that would have been too much for me. I mean, I've had to deal with, the going to the grocery store and having the cashier question me because I have, red meat or bacon in my cart and, question me. When I was going through grad school, I was a personal trainer. So I'd come in wearing my shirt from the gym and I'd be buying that. And they'd be like, well, how can you be a personal trainer, but you're eating foods like that? And, it'd be for a while, it's really hard for me to, try to deal with those situations. So I usually try to, in that sense, when that show came out, I was like, I can't sit down and watch this. I think it's going to be bad for me.
Yeah, I had about 5,000 messages the month or two after that was released. You're like, have you watched this yet? I'm just like, no, I don't play those games. I know what it's about. Yeah. I mean, if they want to provide actual RCTs on why any of that stuff would be beneficial, then great, I'm all for it. Like all I want to do is figure out the truth and like what works for me as an individual. Those are the two things that I care about, and then trying to help spread that as much as possible. But when you take things and conflate them and make them appear like truth, but they're not, that's where I have a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of what happened for me too, is just, when people would ask me if I saw it, I kind of just took the approach of, well, what did it say? And then I'll kind of let you know my thoughts on that. And because usually a lot of the stuff on that show, it was pretty easy to debunk it. It was really just garbage research. But there was that. And then obviously last year there was the big spill with coconut oil, with everybody talking about how bad that was for you, and really poorly cited studies behind that as well. But one thing that I get a lot for people who are completely new to keto and like they've never heard of it. I actually just helped one of my really good friends start doing keto a couple weeks ago, and he had never really kind of dug into it and learned what it was. And when you tell people that they can't have fruit on keto, they automatically assume that it's like the worst diet in the world because they think that like fruit is so good for you. So that's always kind of a fun one because a lot of people get really confused because they're like, well, we're promoting like animal meat and stuff, but like no fruit, like that has to be a terrible diet for you.
Right. And so the reason why people think fruit is healthy in the first place is just because it looks like a vegetable and they think that vegetables are healthy just because, they're not animal products. I think that's kind of the train of thought there. Right. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things. If you look at how fruit was like bred to what it is now, like you're not going to have a banana like you have today 100 years ago. Like these things were little nubs that were super bitter and probably full of way more nutrients. Like we've genetically selected these things and pushed them forward. GMO like or not, it doesn't matter. We've selected. You can still do stuff without genetically modifying plants to make them not represent their predecessors. And select for the sweeter thing and the sweeter thing and the sweeter thing. Same thing with apples. Apples used to be like little cranberry to crabapple size things. Like they were not these giant juicy things that tasted like candy. And so I'm not saying like this is going to kill you, but the sugar density of it is super high, and then also the composition of the sugars in it. Some of these things having super high fructose content. It's not going to be very friendly to ketogenic diet. You want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, and you covered one of the two things I always tell people too is, one, fructose. There's been a lot of stuff out there showing that fructose can be really detrimental to your health when consumed, really highly. But also, the nutrient side of things. So, the whole point of really why you would even eat fruit is because of some of the nutrients that might be found in there. But the truth is there's keto foods that have, way more abundance of nutrients than fruit. Like, people talk about like bananas for potassium, but, an avocado has way more potassium in it than a banana. So, really if your argument with fruit is the nutrients, then you're going to be able to get those nutrients on keto without fructose and all the other sugars. So that's usually what I kind of tell people to combat it, because it is kind of a tough thing, because even for all of us, we've been brought up our whole life with the apple a day keeps the doctor away approach of just having fruit and it being good for you. But we like you said, overconsumption of fructose is definitely not going to be a good thing.
The people who generally freak out about that recommendation of no fruit, I tell them you get 1 handful of berries per day.
Yeah,
make it count.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that some of the low glycemic berries can be good. The issue, I always kind of like hesitate on recommending those, because just like what you said, a lot of people have a hard time limiting themselves, because if they, some of those berries there, that's going to be, if you've been doing keto and you've been really restricting anything sweet, that those berries might be the thing that, like, the sweetest thing you've had. But if you, like myself, I like to include berries in my diet because I've always been pretty decent with like portion control. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's kind of one of those ones where you got to make sure that you're controlling how much you're having.
So another thing too that you mentioned earlier is, is it safe, or can you be, or should you be in ketosis long term? This is probably one of the top 5 questions that I get. So what's your take here?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, because obviously this is kind of new. Like, we don't really have much research on people who have been doing keto for a whole life. Like, there is research out there in animals. I know there was some rat research published over the last couple of years, kind of comparing like lifelong diets, looking at like keto and Western, and the results on those studies were really good. But so there's really not too much out there on it. But I think that with the way that we see how most conditions seem to be able to be progressed by chronic high carb consumption, that kind of leads me to believe that we should probably always at least be restricting carbs. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that like you have to be in a state of ketosis at all times. Like I always tell people, like if you're doing the ketogenic diet for the next 40 years of your life, like, yeah, chances are you're going to come out of ketosis at some point. But I don't really think that there's anything detrimental to health when it comes to being in ketosis long term. I think if anything, it's going to be a good way to prevent yourself from developing a lot of these like neurodegenerative diseases. And really, I think that we're kind of seeing the first population of people coming in where people at a young age are starting this lifestyle that they are going to be continuing what it seems like for a long time. So it's going to be really interesting to see how different, health markers and everything change as time progresses. But I haven't seen anything yet that tells me that it's harmful to be in ketosis long term.
Yeah, I think it's a mindset thing where people want all or nothing. So they want to be told, you shouldn't do it because it's unsafe, or you should only do that. And it's like,
right.
I don't think it's going to be a bad thing if you go in and out of ketosis or ketogenic state throughout your life. Like, I don't think you need to commit 100%. And if you can't do that, then it's completely worthless. And I don't think that it's unsafe either. And these are the things too that you should be tracking subjectively and objectively. So like you said earlier, if you're feeling great, well, good. Keep doing those things.
Right.
And if people, if they're tracking their blood work and they're looking at things objectively, if things are changing, in an evidence-based way, not just, is my cholesterol, quote unquote, cholesterol getting higher, which we can unpack that for days.
Right.
Like we need to be looking at these things, and even blood markers are tough to get a huge objective measure on, because our blood markers and what we have for reference ranges are based upon people who go to the doctor because they have health problems.
Right.
and so of course you're going to have some skewed bias there about what's healthy and what's not healthy. But generally I tell people, like, if they're feeling good and overall everything else is tracking great, then just keep doing it. Like, there's no reason to fiddle with it otherwise. And another thing too about food choices, can I have this on keto? If it's a high fat product or something like that, it's like, I mean, do you like it? Does it taste good? Does it help you do the diet more? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is it helping you reach your goal? What is your goal? And I think that framing that mindset, and like, okay, if it's fat loss and you're just eating like fat bombs and bacon and cream cheese all day, like you're probably not going to get there very quickly.
Right.
And so like, is it helping you reach your goal? Yes or no? Like, my goals are just to feel great, have low inflammation, and have a lot of mental output. And for me, I eat the things that help me reach that quicker. What about you? Like, where are you at on that spectrum? And like, how are you using a ketogenic diet in your day to day?
Yeah, so I've kind of like luckily with doing it for, coming up on 3 years, I've tried a lot of different things and kind of figured out what works best for me. So, like you said, it always depends on what the goal is at the time. So, like I know for me, if I'm trying to, maybe I'm trying to go through a period of time where I'm trying to lose a little bit more body fat, or maybe I'm trying to put on a little more muscle, I can manipulate my macronutrients accordingly. But for me, like similar to you, my biggest thing is cognitive output and overall health. So, I know that like I feel way better when I'm in the morning, when I'm on keto and I'm fasted and I'm working. I know that like, my quality of life and feeling of well-being is better. So that's why like a lot of people ask me like if I track on keto, and the truth is I don't, just because with the satiety that I experience on keto, I'm typically in a calorie deficit. And I'm only doing this, right now, my main goal is just making sure that I'm, like you said, low inflammation and good cognitive flow. So I just kind of, stick to the keto friendly foods and eat when I'm hungry. But that's kind of the beauty of it, is that like there's a lot of different ways that you can adjust the diet and according to your goal.
So are you in a state of ketosis 100% of the time?
Well, that's a good question, because I stopped testing myself as frequently about 5-6 months ago, just because I was kind of going through this kind of phase with a lot of my clients, where a lot of like for a while I was doing some keto coaching, and a lot of people were freaking out about their ketone levels. And I'd always tell them like, it's really hard for us to understand these ketone levels. Like, is higher blood ketone levels better or worse? Like, we really don't know. So I use blood ketone testing for, if I'm trying to test certain different things, or maybe I'm trying to test a product or whatnot. But I would venture to say that like I'm in ketosis all the time based on the way that I feel. I kind of talk about this pretty openly, where like, if I'm going home, back to see my family and stuff, and, my mom makes like something that like that I really want to have, like, I'm not doing keto for some condition where it's going to be really harmful for me to come out of ketosis. So I might, supplement accordingly, because I usually supplement during this time, but I might have some carbs during that time. But when I'm just kind of in my regular flow down here in Florida, working and everything, I'd say, 100% of the time I'm usually in keto.
Right. And you said you supplement with stuff. What is that you supplement with to help reduce the burden?
Yeah. So usually the two things for me, my three strategies and two supplements that I do is I usually do berberine beforehand, and then the next day I usually do I fast and take exogenous, or sometimes it's exogenous ketones at night, or the next day while I'm fasting. But those are kind of the three: berberine, fasting, and exogenous ketones.
Yeah, berberine has been pretty fascinating. I've seen research now that shows it's more effective at reducing glucose than metformin.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just a normal plant that they ground up. And so that's something that I actually use as well, depending on what I'm having. So I have the same exact strategy. Like when I'm at home and in my routine, super I have 9 foods I eat, and those foods are ketogenic friendly. Obviously right now it's just all super high fat animal products, but I'm going to Mexico City in a few weeks, and I will not only be eating high fat animal products there. Like, I'm going to be probably eating carbohydrates, and that, I mean, I'm not going to feel guilty about it. Mm-hmm. And so this is an approach to that. I think that people, they feel a level of guilt when they start identifying with things. And this is where I think people get in trouble. I mean, this is what I saw a lot with the paleo community. There was a lot of general good recommendations originally when it started coming out. People were eating way more whole food. Fantastic. But then it started getting this identity shift and this dogma that a lot of, I think, vegan and vegetarianism gets conflicted with, and makes documentaries to support their reasoning because they have their little clan they need to be a part of. And I think that the one thing I really hope doesn't happen is that ketogenic diet falls into this. And this is why I like the ketogenic diet so much, separate from a paleo diet, is that it's a metabolic state. Are you using fat for fuel, or are you not? Like, there's not much other to say to that. But I think the ideals of taking sides of oh, well, if you're not in keto 100% of the time, then that's bad, and you're not in my club anymore. I think that stuff is a little ridiculous. But not feeling guilty with yourself, and realizing that you are a human and you have certain biology that can shift, and it's normal to be able to, yes, you can process carbohydrates, and if you lose a ketogenic state, you're not doing irreversible harm. And you can still join the club. You can still hang out with all the other keto fans. No problem there.
Yeah, and it's funny because I usually kind of hesitate to let people know this until they're, a little bit further into keto. But, I think that, one of the things we know about keto is that if you've been following keto long term, like you should be more insulin sensitive, and which means that you should better utilize carbs when you take them. So like, I'm sure you found this in yourself too, but I've known, when I first started keto, I did 8 months of very strict keto. Like I didn't break it at all. My first time being home for the holidays, like Thanksgiving and Christmas, I stuck with it. And I think that was really important because it kind of put my body in a state where I feel like I became very metabolically flexible, where I would notice that like if I did have carbs, maybe the next day I didn't feel great in the morning, but I was able to get back into ketosis very quickly by using some of these strategies. And I think that that's something that happens, when you've been adapted long term. If you're somebody who's been doing, I give this analogy the other day, but my analogy for this I always talk about is like, if you think about like ketosis as like a fire, when you first start keto, you're kindling it and it's really small. Any gust of wind or drop of rain can put it out, and it can take a really long time to start up again. But the longer you've been doing keto and the longer you've been kindling that fire, the harder it is for wind and rain to come in and really knock it out. So that's kind of something where I've seen where people who do keto for a long term, like if they are going on vacation, I would rather have somebody go on vacation and enjoy their foods that they want to have so they can come back and get on it, rather than going there, restricting themselves, not having a good time, and then coming back and being resentful towards the diet and, setting themselves up for failure in terms of staying to it long term.
Right. Yeah. And you make a really good point too. The longer that you do adapt to this, and like, I think that probably you and I both, when we started getting into this stuff, were, young, relatively active males who didn't have a lot of metabolic problems. Like if you're coming from a state of where you have years and decades of metabolic dysregulation and mitochondrial dysfunction, it's probably going to take you a little bit longer to get to that point where you're metabolically flexible. So yes, I completely agree that, initially it might take a lot to get that fire stoked and you're really burning that fuel. But then afterwards, like you said, once you get to a point where you've reached all your goals, and this is where I like to tell people, is like, if you have goals that shift from day to day, like a fat loss goal, or like I'm treating diabetes and I want to get my HbA1c to a certain level, like just stick to it until you reach that goal. It's goals like ours where it's, I want good mental output. Like, okay, well, that's not going to, like, I don't have like a target of like, I want my brain to work at this certain frequency and I'm working towards that. And so I think that once you get to that point where your goals shift and you're using a strategy like this to maintain a certain lifestyle, well, then I think that peeling back from it and if you want to eat carbs, you want to do this or that, then it's completely fine. And like, this is one of the things that I have, is like, I go to Japan somewhat frequently and like I eat rice there, totally eat rice. But the next day, if I do the same thing fast or take some exogenous ketones, and then the next day or that night of, I'm back in ketosis. And these are the things too, like, it's how your metabolism is today or before you get started on a ketogenic diet is not how it will be a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now. Like you always have to adapt to these things.
Right. Yeah. And that's why, you kind of said it earlier, but the biggest thing is like this whole thing is an N of one. Like I always kind of joke that like the people that speak more definitively and about anything, especially in the keto space, are usually the ones that don't know quite as much, because it's really hard to say, to give like an exact prescription to anybody. But I think the biggest thing is like, if you're new to this diet, you want to stay the course for a pretty good amount of time when you first start, to allow your body time. And, that could take 6-8 months, 10 months to a year to get your body kind of repaired and restored. Like you said, improving mitochondrial function and improving insulin sensitivity and all of those things. So, it's definitely one of those things where you got to really test your body and see how it is. But like you said, if you want to have some carbohydrates and you've been doing keto for a while, I would much rather you have those and get right back on it, rather than, like I've talked to people where you see it's either they're going to have some carbohydrates and get back on it the next day, or they're going to go crazy and have a weekend full of tacos, pizza, and ice cream. And that's going to be super, counterproductive to what they're trying to do. So, lifestyle is the biggest thing. So, make sure that you're taking care of your mental health and keeping yourself in a good state there as well.
That's a good point, man. And like you said, my most frequent answer to people's questions about a ketogenic diet is it depends. So,
right.
Yeah. All right, man.
Everything starts with it depends.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show. I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground here, and I think that this will probably set the stage for round 2, 3, 4, or 5. Why don't you let people know where they can find you and all your work?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me. I really had a great time talking to you today. If you guys are looking for some of my work, I just launched my blog where I'm just putting up, some more personal insight from me. It's at theketologist.com. And then, you guys can find me on Instagram or Facebook at the Ketologist. Instagram is definitely the big one for me. I've been trying to put myself out there more on Facebook. I'm just have never been a huge fan of it, but I know it's a good way to reach some people and get information out there. So those are the 3 hubs that you guys can kind of come to me if you have questions or looking for information.
All right. Appreciate it, my man.
All right. Thanks a lot, Anthony.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.